A year or two after our father died, my brother Bill made a very interesting comment about Dad. He said that it must have been particularly tough for a man like Dad, who had been so competent in everything that he had done throughout his successful career. Must have been especially tough for him to withstand the diminishing of his abilities as his dementia encroached on him and made his world and his vocabulary and abilities smaller and smaller and smaller until they went away and he was left with a little nugget of who he had been. A little wizened old man crouched in a fetal position when he died. In the weeks before he died, he was unable to say anything, to manufacture any phrases at all. In the months before he died, he could speak some, but in faltering, weirdly combined phrases. And he'd been such an articulate man, such a good speech maker and crowd pleaser with his talks. He wasn't a politician, but he was able to inform people in a measured, wise way throughout his adult years. And for that to go away from the time he was roughly 75 or so until he died a week shy of 82 must have been excruciating for him. I had to agree when Bill said this, that Dad had been a very competent person. Yet that wasn't the first word that would have occurred to me when thinking of our father. It would have been this word, wise and modest in his own way. He was a great man in the sense that he didn't push his skills on others, didn't show them off in any visible way, at least. And there was a difference in how Bill and I saw our father, because Bill had been the firstborn. He was 12 years older than I was. He was pressured in different ways than I ever was. I was hardly pressured at all, coming along last. And so he had withstood some bossiness on Dad's part that I'd never had to tolerate. Instead, I got to share the happy project of building with Dad a small dinghy that we put together in the front driveway, made of red paint and glue and marine plywood. It came to be called my dinghy. And I got to learn how to sail larger boats with my parents when all three of us were beginners. We had reached a point in our family's life where we could afford a sailboat, finally. Dad was teaching at Cornell at that point, had a good salary, was finally able to start saving a bit of money after all his missionary years in India, when he'd saved nothing and we'd barely eked out a living, even though he was the head of the institute where he taught in Allahabad. But in Ithaca, he was able finally to pamper himself a little bit, going out on the lake, navigating just with the wind and the smoke from his pipe and the peacefulness of a quiet, sunny, breezy day in upstate New York. He had tried sailing in Allahabad. He'd had this ambition even then. As a freshly arrived missionary, he looked around on the river that flowed between the institute and the larger city beyond, the Jamuna River, and observed that there were no sailboats, as he knew them, on the river. There were only rowboats of different sizes. They ranged between about 12 feet long and 18 feet long, and they were made of rolled sheet iron. So they were kind of on the heavy side for the casing for a sailboat, but he thought he'd make do with what he had, and he and a friend bought a used 14-foot rowboat. They figured out a way to plant the mast in the front of the boat, or step the mast, as mariners like to say. It was a bamboo mast that they used, and they contrived a sort of a way to build a centerboard well. They built a centerboard to go down into the water for stability. and they rigged up kind of an ingenious rudder device for steering. And a friend of theirs, who was adept at sewing, bought some shirting material in the local bazaar and sewed up a sail for them. So they were in business then, except for the fact that the boat didn't work very well going against the wind. It went just fine as long as they were going downriver with the current, but when they turned around and tried to come back upriver, they had problems, or whenever they tried going against the wind. So Dad called this boat the May Return, and that's how it worked. Sometimes it was able to get back under its own power, but more often, he said, they had to throw a rope from the front of the boat to the tow path along the river and get towed by some water buffalo or some mules or something back home to the Institute. Anyway, when we were in Ithaca in the late 50s, so Dad at this point would have been in his late 40s, approaching 50, was when we first attempted to sail on Cayuga Lake. He had become friends with a man named Dave Cutting, who worked at a place called Pritchard Motors. I think it was a Buick dealer out on the Elmira Road in Ithaca. Later on, Dave Cutting had his own dealership, Cutting Motors, and he and Dad stayed friends over the decades. As long as Dad lived, Dave Cutting would take care of him and make sure Dad had some dependable, reliable sort of used car that he could use. I remember we had a Honda Civic at some point, then a Honda Accord late in Dad's life. They all worked quite well. Dave Cutting was a good friend to Dad. Well, he must have heard that Dad was interested in learning how to sail. I don't know how they got to know each other. Dad was not in the car dealership business himself. He worked at the agricultural college, Cornell. But he had a knack of getting to know people and was genuinely interested in all sorts of people. Dave Cutting came to him and said, you know, Art, my main sailboat that I use is at the yacht club, but we've got another boat that we're kind of phasing out. We keep it at the marina at Myers Point on the east side of the lake. The yacht club was on the west side of the lake, about 8 or 9 miles north from Ithaca. Myers was an equal distance, maybe 10 miles up the east shore of the lake. Dave Cutting said, why don't you try using this boat? And if you find you like sailing this boat, then in time you can shop around and find a better boat you might want to buy and get serious with. You might even want to join the yacht club. So Dad took him up on this offer. He may have paid Dave Cutting a nominal rent for his boat, or may not have, I'm not sure. But on Saturdays and Sundays, we would drive up to Myers Point. There was a place along the way, nearly at Myers, that sold hamburgers for a very low price. I think they were like some odd price, like 12 cents a burger or 17 cents. We'd get some hamburgers and eat, and then we'd try out this small wooden sailboat of Dave Cutting's. They were starting to make boats out of fiberglass in those days. So this was a bit of a throwback, this wooden boat, and somewhat of a relic. But it worked fine. It floated. Didn't leak water. We didn't have to bail it or anything. It had a mainsail and a jib. It was maybe 15 or 16 feet long. It was called the National One. That was the model sailboat it was. We would take it out for short sails and experiment. Dad would have his book with lessons on how to tack, how to go across the wind, how to turn and go down with the wind. We learned just a little of this and a little of that, enough to start feeling that we were competent out on the water in our bright orange life jackets. Mostly it was Dad and my mother and I who went. Sometimes my sister Ann would go along. Bill and Ted, our older brothers, were not so likely to go. They didn't like being bossed around by Dad any more than they had to be. They were teenagers, and they'd been bossed enough when he and they were building our house. So one time, Mom and Dad and I were out on this boat on a hot sunny day in the summertime. Enough breeze just to get us out into the very middle of the lake. So it was about a mile to the west shore and a mile back to the east shore to Myers Marina, where we come from. The breeze got us out there, and then the breeze died. It died absolutely. There weren't patches of breeze we could hunt for. There was no breeze. The water was glassy, glassy still. The mast was straight up, kind of tottering, because there was no breeze to fill out the sail and stabilize the mast. And the sail was just luffing in place, restless, desolate, hot. We waited. We could feel the sunburn forming on our skin while motorboats went cruising past and up and down the lake. And every now and then, one went close enough to us on this glassy water that we would rock in its wake and then finally go still and sit some more. But Dad, mainly because he smoked his pipe, was able to look very much the sailboat captain and wise old man of the lake, even though we had no breeze to stir us into motion. He had on his aviator-style dark glasses, and he'd peer off at the horizon in a way that made me think, looking at him, that he knew absolutely what he was doing, and he knew a breeze would come. This was the day I would find out how little he and we as a group knew about sailing. Finally, he said, I think there's a sign of hope here. Look at over there in the northwest. Look up the lake and across there. See those dark clouds? We all turned and looked, and sure enough, there was a small bank of dark clouds off in the distance. And as we kept examining this bank of clouds, it seemed indeed to be approaching slowly. He said, I think that might be a rainstorm coming. And as it comes, I'm pretty sure it'll have some breeze pushing ahead of it, and that'll be enough to get us back into shore and we'll be fine. So we waited with confidence for this natural phenomenon to occur, and it did. Here came this nice breeze. There were ripples on the water, patches, and then it was a steady breeze, and we started our progress in reaching across the wind, heading towards Myers Point. But then all of a sudden, the rain started whipping down, and the breeze was not a breeze anymore. It was a hard, buffeting wind. And as it came up, the waves suddenly materialized on all sides of us, and they weren't coming in one steady direction. They were chopping at us from this direction and that, and making it difficult for us to keep the boat on a steady course where we wanted to go, and difficult to keep the sail as full as we wanted it, and the boom out in the position we wanted it. Now, this would have been a good time for us to bring down the jib, and maybe if we had known how to roll up the boom so the mainsail was smaller, if this boat was able to do that. We learned this later, but we sure didn't know it then. And the storm descended on us, and when we should have had the sails all the way down, and should have turned the bow into the wind to ride out the storm. And furthermore, if we'd known, toss a pail over the bow with a rope tied to it that would form a kind of sea anchor, as it was called, and keep our nose into the wind and keep us from harm's way. But we didn't know about that. Finally, when we thought too late of bringing the sail down, the knots we had made were wet from the storm. We couldn't get them untied. The cleats were hard to maneuver. And suddenly there was a terrible ripping noise. The mast flopped one way, flopped the other, kept going over, and we had capsized, with the mast not upright as it was supposed to be, but all the way down. They call that turning turtle on a sailboat. And it was a bad situation because the hull now was in this shape, and we were here somewhere under the hull, the three of us. We did have our life belts on, our life vests, which was good. They were bright orange. It helped us see each other. First my mother and then me bobbing to the surface. But where was Dad? We looked around. We knew that what we were supposed to do was to hold on to the boat. We had discussed this. He had said, if we go over, be sure you hang on to the boat. Don't try swimming anywhere. Hang on to the boat, then we'll be all right. We'll wait for help. So Mom and I were hanging on, all right. But we were looking around for him. Where was he? Then finally, after a minute or two, a long time, he came breathing heavily, working his way around the outside of the boat to where we were clinging to the stern. Where were you? Said my mother. And he said, well, I was kind of trapped underneath. There was a rope looped around my arm and I had to get a knot untied so I could get myself free, but I couldn't see underneath the water. So I had to do it with my eyes closed. I always keep my eyes closed when I'm underwater, so I couldn't see anything. I had to do it by feel. And I said, you don't open your eyes underwater, Dad? He said, I never have been able to do that. If I'm underwater, I have to keep my eyes closed. So I told myself, the important thing is, don't panic. You have this one breath to give you enough time to get this knot undone and get free, and then you can get out and join the others. And I didn't panic. I mean, I was scared, but I got the knot undone, and here I am. So everything's all right. But he seemed kind of wheezy and unsure of himself. Still, as the three of us clung to the stern of the boat and got colder and colder, our orange life vests bobbing in the gray, murky day, what I couldn't stop thinking about as a little boy of 9 was the idea of Dad underwater with his eyes closed, because swimming underwater had been one of my favorite things since the time I'd learned to swim. And I'd always had my eyes wide open underwater and would coast along. I felt much more buoyant and free swimming underwater than on the surface. I loved swimming underwater, and I would look at everything. I'd watch the seaweed. I'd watch the bottom of the lake. So it was an astonishment to me that here was a skill I had to a greater extent than my father. My father was so good at so many things, and yet I was better at swimming underwater. Maybe I was better at surviving a sea wreck than he was. This opened my eyes to all sorts of possibilities. I was just a kid, and I assumed that everyone else who was bigger was better at most everything than I was. And the idea that I could do something better, I could swim underwater with great ease and comfort, and I would have had no problem undoing a knot, or so I thought, underwater. So that was what I was mulling over in the 15 or 20 minutes. We were getting progressively colder and waiting for the storm to pass, or possibly someone coming close enough to us in a motorboat that they would see us and stop to help. And eventually, that was what happened. Fairly big cabin cruiser came along. It was going the same direction we were, in toward Myers Point, and the marina, to get into shelter from the storm, because they weren't enjoying themselves either. They saw the distress we were in, and they edged over to us. From the leeward side, they came up to us gradually and tossed a ladder over the side of their boat near the stern, but not too near the engine. And it wasn't a rope ladder, it was a wooden slatted ladder. It might have had ropes coming down, but it was wood to stand on. The three of us worked our way up. Last came the captain himself, Art Mosier, my father. He may have lost his pipe by this time. He may have lost some degree of his dignity. He was not the all-seeing ship captain anymore. He was a man who was trembling with cold, his face gray from exhaustion. The man who was at the wheel of this cabin cruiser took one look at Dad and said, "Fella, you need some medicine. I'm going to get you some medicine to perk you up." And he had one of his sons dodge below and bring back a bottle of brandy and a glass, and they gave Dad a big chug of brandy to drink. He drank that in sips and was not about to have a heart attack, as some of us had feared he might. He looked that tired that we wondered if something terrible might be happening to him, but he came back to his ruddy complexion and health. And we were all relieved. We towed the boat in gradually through the still buffeting waves. The storm had not passed and didn't pass until we got into the marina and got the sailboat put away in its little slip between two small docks where it belonged. And then we went on back into Ithaca and had a good meal and talked over how lucky we had been for no worse an event to develop. In the weeks that followed, we would go out to Myers sometimes. First, we'd have to bail the boat because it was sunk. It was still floating, but with the deck of the sailboat just at water level and the hull entirely under the water. We'd bail it all out. It would rise gradually. It was a lot of work to bail it out. Then we'd sit and watch it when it was bailed out and was buoyant, and gradually it would start to sink again. When we told Dave Cutting about our experience, he said, "Look, that boat's had it. It's not worth it getting a new sail for it and putting it in dry dock and patching it all up, fixing it, sanding it, painting it. Too much work for what it is." I'd say we have to write that off as a dead loss. And if you liked sailing up to this day, you had such a bad experience in that line squall, then maybe you'd like to buy your own boat. And I would recommend buying a fiberglass boat. That's what I ended up buying finally. It's much easier to take care of and just as much fun. There's a new kind of boat coming out some people have been talking about. You might consider that. It's a fiberglass boat, and it's got a false bottom so that it keeps the center of gravity up a little higher in the water. If you do happen to capsize, it's not such a tragedy in this kind of boat because you can stand on the centerboard and it'll tip the boat back up. And anyway, it's a thought. You could consider that. And we did. This new sort of boat was called a mobjack. It was a brand new model, just came out that particular year. A number of our neighbors on North Sunset Drive became enthusiastic about the idea of sailing mobjacks. If you got organized and got a dozen people together to buy 12 boats, you'd get a cut rate on the boats. And we all joined the yacht club and formed our own racing group. We would race these mobjacks. They not only had a mainsail and a jib, they had the spinnaker, which was this lovely balloon-shaped sail that would bail out in front of the boat when you were going with the wind, when the wind was directly behind you, and you would go terrifically fast, although it didn't feel like it because you were going with the wind, so the wind wasn't battering against you. In racing, there would be this one leg of a race where everyone had their spinnakers deployed. Each boat's spinnaker was a different set of colors. It was very pretty, but they were finicky things, spinnakers. It was fine as long as the wind was directly behind you and it would puff out in front, the spinnaker. But if a little blast of air came in diagonally, it could upset everything and the spinnaker could go dragging in the front water and you could go over, which did happen. It happened to us, it happened to the others, and we all learned how to deal with it because this boat was designed to rectify itself with minimal effort if that happened. Dad did become competent at sailing. I grew competent myself at sailing a boat. But what seemed even more significant to me was I sailed with the secret knowledge that I was far more competent, even than Dad. at swimming underwater with my eyes open.